The rupture came without warning. In the darkest hour before dawn, Ned Stark woke to a sound he couldn't name, not thunder, not wind, but something that felt like the world itself groaning under unbearable weight. He threw off his furs and moved to the window of his chambers in Winterfell, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The stars were wrong, not absent, not hidden by clouds, but wrong. Constellations he'd known since childhood had shifted, and new patterns blazed across the northern sky, configurations that had no names, that seemed to pulse with light that was not quite starlight. The air itself felt different, charged with something ancient and electric, and for a moment Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, felt like a child again, small and uncertain in a world far larger than he'd imagined. "Ned?" Catelyn's voice came from behind him, heavy with sleep and concern. "What is it?" "I don't know," he said quietly, and the admission cost him something. Lords were supposed to have answers. But something has changed. He dressed quickly, not bothering with formal clothing, and made his way to the castle walls. He wasn't the only one. Guardsmen stood at their posts, staring skyward with expressions that ranged from fear to wonder. Maester Luwin was already there, his weathered face turned upward, his usual composure fractured. "My lord," the maester said without looking away from the sky. "I've studied the stars for 40 years. These—" He trailed off, as if the words had fled from him. "These are not our stars." "What does that mean?" Ned asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "I don't know, my lord, but something fundamental has changed. Not just the sky, can you feel it? The very air tastes different." Ned could feel it. There was a weight to the world now that hadn't been there when he'd gone to sleep, as if reality itself had become heavier, denser, more present. By the time dawn broke, and even the dawn seemed different, the light-carrying hues Ned had never seen before, reports began flooding in from across the north. A trader from White Harbor claimed the road east had vanished, replaced by a forest of trees so massive they dwarfed even the oldest weirwoods. A farmer swore his land now bordered a river that hadn't existed yesterday, its waters running silver in the strange new light. A hunter reported mountains on the horizon where no mountains had ever stood. "It's not possible," Catelyn said as they reviewed the reports in the great hall. "Geography doesn't just change." "And yet it has," Ned replied. He looked at the assembled household: Catelyn, Robb, Maester Luwin, Sir Roderick Castle, and others who'd gathered as news spread. "We need to understand what's happened. Send riders to our bannermen. I want reports from every corner of the north. And prepare ravens for King's Landing. Robert needs to know." "Father," Robb spoke up, his young face serious beyond his years. "What if this isn't just happening in the north?" It was the question Ned had been avoiding. "Then," he said slowly, "the whole world has changed overnight, and no one knows what that means." In King's Landing, 300 leagues to the south, the rupture had been felt just as keenly, though interpreted very differently. Cersei Lannister stood in the throne room, alone save for the ever-present guards who'd learned long ago not to look directly at the Queen. The Iron Throne loomed before her, that ugly, magnificent seat of power forged from the swords of Aegon the Conqueror's enemies. She'd sat in it before, during Robert's absences, feeling its sharp edges pressed through fabric to remind her that power always had a price. But something had changed. She'd come here after the strange sounds woke her, after the servants began whispering of lights in the sky and impossible visions. She'd come to reassure herself that some things, at least, remained constant. The throne, the power it represented, the inevitability of Lannister supremacy. Instead, she found something else. The throne was warm, not metaphorically, literally warm to the touch, as if the metal itself pulsed with internal heat. When she laid her hand on one of the sword hilts that formed its arms, she felt something surge through her. Not pain, but presence. As if the throne itself had become aware, as if it recognized her touch and responded to it. Your Grace? She turned sharply to find Grand Maester Pycelle shuffling into the throne room, his ancient face creased with worry. Forgive the intrusion, but the small council is gathering. There are reports, strange reports. The king has requested. I know what the king has requested. Cersei cut him off. Robert requested many things: wine, whores, hunting trips. Rarely did he request anything that mattered. Tell the council I will join them shortly. After Pycelle departed, she turned back to the throne, reached out once more to touch it. Again, that surge of warmth, of recognition, of power. Something had changed in the night, and Cersei Lannister, who'd spent her entire life surrounded by men who underestimated her, wondered if perhaps the change might favor those bold enough to seize it. The small council meeting was, as she'd expected, chaos barely contained by protocol. Robert slouched in his seat at the head of the table, already drinking despite the early hour. Lord Eddard Stark's chair sat empty. He was still in the north, thankfully. Lord Varys had his usual expression of polite concern. Petyr Baelish wore an amused smile that suggested he alone found the crisis entertaining. Grand Maester Pycelle wheezed through a report about astronomical impossibilities. Sir Barristan Selmy stood at attention, hand on sword hilt, as if prepared to fight whatever supernatural force had disrupted the kingdom. Reports from every corner of the realm. Your Grace, Pycelle was saying. The Reach claims the Rosa Road now passes through lands that weren't there yesterday. Dorne reports mountains appearing along their northern border. The Riverlands, this is madness. Robert interrupted, waving his cup dismissively. Mountains don't appear overnight. Roads don't change. These are the ravings of panicked peasants who've had too much ale. If I may, Your Grace, Varys's soft voice cut through the room like a knife. My little birds have brought similar reports from every region. Too many reports, too consistent, to be mere fancy. Something has indeed changed. Changed how? Robert demanded. Did the gods wake up and decide to rearrange the map? Is this some Targaryen curse? Or perhaps, he laughed bitterly, perhaps I'm simply too drunk to understand reality anymore. The last possibility seems most likely, Cersei said coolly, and watched Robert's face darken. She continued before he could explode. However, in this instance, the wine is not to blame. Something has happened. The question is what we do about it. Lord Stark has sent word, Littlefinger spoke up, his voice smooth as silk. He's dispatching riders across the north to assess the situation. He suggests we do the same across the southern kingdoms, and he's requested a great council, all the major houses gathering here to share information and coordinate a response. A council, Robert said the word like a curse. More talking, more politics. What I need is someone to explain to me what in seven hells is happening to my kingdom. Perhaps, Varys said delicately, the explanation lies beyond your Grace's kingdom. Everyone turned to look at the spy master. He spread his hands in a gesture of innocent inquiry. My little birds have brought other news as well. Whispers of strange travelers on the roads. People who speak languages no one recognizes. Traders who claim to have encountered, well, beings of unusual appearance. Speak plainly, Varys, Cersei snapped. There are reports, Your Grace, of individuals who are not quite human, taller than any man, impossibly beautiful, with eyes that reflect light like a cat's. They've been seen near the new borders, the places where the land has changed most dramatically. Fairy tales, Robert scoffed. Perhaps, Varys agreed. Or perhaps the fairy tales are walking among us now. Either way, we should investigate before we dismiss. Littlefinger leaned back in his chair, that smile still playing at his lips. If I might make a practical suggestion? Whatever has happened has created confusion. Confusion creates opportunity. New lands mean new resources, new trade routes, new possibilities for those clever enough to recognize them. We should be mapping these changes, establishing control, claiming what we can before others do. You want to profit from a catastrophe? Sir Barristan said with barely concealed disgust. I want to ensure the crown profits, Littlefinger corrected smoothly. Or would you prefer our enemies claim these new territories first? Cersei watched the exchange with interest. Littlefinger was right. Of course he usually was about such matters. Whatever had happened, it represented opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. The question was how to do so without appearing too eager, too grasping. Lord Stark's suggestion of a great council is sound, she said. We need information, but Lord Baelish is also correct. We cannot afford to be passive. Send scouts to map the changes. Send traders to establish contact with these unusual travelers. And send ravens to all the great houses. If this affects all the realm should be represented in our response. Robert grunted, which everyone had learned to interpret as reluctant agreement. The meeting continued, devolving into arguments about logistics and jurisdiction, but Cersei's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the throne room, about the warmth she'd felt when she touched the Iron Throne, about power, and how it might be shifting in ways no one yet understood. 300 leagues north and east of King's Landing, in a land Robert Baratheon had never heard of, another council was taking place. Rivendell had stood for ages beyond counting, a refuge of beauty and wisdom in a world too often dominated by darkness. Elrond, half-elven, had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, had witnessed the great and terrible events that shaped the world. But even he, with millennia of experience to draw upon, had never witnessed anything quite like this. The boundaries have fallen, he said to the assembled council. His voice was grave, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. The separation between worlds maintained since the ancient days, woven into the very fabric of reality, has been breached. Or perhaps breached is too gentle a word. Shattered. Two worlds that were meant to remain forever separate have become one. Gandalf stood at Elrond's side, his staff planted firmly on the marble floor. The wizard's face bore the deep concern of one who understood exactly what this meant. I felt it the moment it happened, he said, like a great rope snapping, releasing tensions that had been held for eons. The boundaries were not merely lines on a map or abstract magical constructs. They were load-bearing structures, and now they're gone. What does that mean for us? Legolas asked. The elf prince from Mirkwood stood near the window, his keen eyes searching the transformed horizon. What is this other world that's merged with ours? A world of men, Elrond replied. Vast kingdoms, ancient feuds, complex politics. They call their land Westeros, and from what I've been able to discern through our scouts, it's a realm of both great civilization and great barbarism. They have no elves, no dwarves, no hobbits. Only men, ruling and fighting and dying as men do. They know nothing of us? Another elf asked. They know stories, Gandalf answered. Legends, fairy tales. To them, we are myths. They have no concept of the true nature of magic, of the ancient powers that shape this world. They are children playing with forces they don't comprehend. And the ring? Galadriel's voice carried across the chamber. Though she herself was not present, her spirit reached across the distance from Lothlorien, projected through the mirror that bore her name. Where is the One Ring? The question hung in the air like a blade. Elrond's face darkened. Lost. The convoy carrying it to the Grey Havens for safekeeping was found destroyed yesterday morning. The guards dead, the chest empty. The rupture happened directly above their position. Whether that's coincidence or design, I cannot say. There are no coincidences where the ring is concerned. Galadriel's voice was soft but carried absolute certainty. It seeks to return to power. Always it seeks. If it has fallen into this new world, among men who know nothing of its nature. She didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the chamber understood the implications. The One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom, containing a portion of his very essence, was not merely an object of power. It was a sentient thing, cunning and patient, with will and purpose of its own. In the hands of someone who understood its danger, it was a terrible threat. In the hands of someone who didn't, we must find it, Legolas said, before these Westerosi do. Agreed, Elrond replied, but we must also establish contact with these people, try to explain what has happened. They will be frightened, confused, possibly hostile. We need to prevent panic from turning into conflict. They will not listen. Galadriel's voice carried a note of profound sadness. I have looked into the mirror, Elrond. I have seen the kingdoms of men in this other world. They are proud. They are fractured by ancient rivalries and fresh ambitions. They will see us not as allies, but as threats to their power, or worse, as opportunities to exploit. Nevertheless, we must try, Gandalf said firmly. He turned to face the council, his gray eyes blazing with determination. I will go. I've walked among men before, advised their kingdoms, tried to guide them toward wisdom. Perhaps I can do so again. You will not go alone. A new voice spoke from the shadows near the entrance. Aragorn stepped forward, his ranger's clothing travel-worn, but his bearing unmistakably noble. If Gandalf speaks truth about these Westerosi, and he always does, they will respect strength more readily than wisdom. A wizard arriving alone might be dismissed as an oddity. A wizard accompanied by warriors might be taken seriously. I will go as well, Legolas said immediately. My father has charged me with investigating these changes. Besides, a faint smile crossed his features. I'm curious to see a land that has never known elves. Elrond looked at them for a long moment, weighing risks against necessities. Finally, he nodded. Very well. Gandalf will lead a delegation to make contact with the Westerosi leaders. Legolas and Aragorn will accompany him. But your primary mission, above all else, is to find the ring. If it falls into the wrong hands before we can recover it, both worlds now will burn, Galadriel finished. Go swiftly. Go carefully, and trust no one who promises easy solutions. The ring will call to those who desire power, and in this new world of Westeros, I sense there are many who desire power very much indeed. The council broke up shortly after, elves dispersing to prepare for the journey or to carry news to their own realms. Gandalf remained, standing at the balcony overlooking the valley, watching the strange new stars that now dotted the sky. Elrond joined him there. You've fought the darkness before, the Elf Lord said quietly. Is this the same enemy? I don't know, Gandalf admitted. Sauron was defeated, his spirit dispersed, his power broken. But the ring remains, and while it exists, the possibility of his return exists as well. If someone in this Westeros were to claim it, to use it, he shook his head. They have no understanding of what they would be unleashing, no context for the ring's true nature. They would see only power, opportunity, advantage over their rivals. And the rupture itself? What caused it? That, Gandalf said grimly, is what truly concerns me. The boundaries between worlds don't simply collapse. They were torn down, Elrond, deliberately or accidentally, I cannot yet say, but there was force behind this. Intent, purpose. He turned to face the Elf Lord directly. Something wanted these worlds to merge, and until we understand what and why, we're fighting blind. At the edge of the world, where ice and darkness had reigned unchallenged for centuries beyond counting, the rupture had been felt most keenly of all. Castle Black, the chief fortress of the Night's Watch, sat astride the wall, that massive barrier of ice and ancient magic, 700 feet tall and hundreds of miles long, built in the distant past to hold back something. The men who wore the black of the Watch knew the old stories, of course. The long night, the others, the dead that walked. But those were legends, campfire tales to frighten new recruits. The real purpose of the wall, everyone knew, was to keep the wildlings from raiding south. Jon Snow knew better than most that the old stories might not be merely stories. He'd felt the rupture like a punch to the chest, a physical sensation that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping. He'd been on watch duty atop the wall when it happened, looking north into the endless expanse of forest and ice beyond. The sound, that impossible, world-groaning sound, had been followed by a flash of light so bright it turned night into day for one eternal moment. And then, cold. Not the ordinary cold of a northern winter. Jon had lived his entire life in the north. He knew cold in all its forms. This was different. This was cold like a living thing, pressing against the wall, testing its strength, searching for weakness. This was cold that carried malice. Did you feel that? Samwell Tarly stood beside him, his face pale even in the darkness. Sam had joined the watch the same day as Jon, and they'd become fast friends despite their vastly different backgrounds. Jon, the acknowledged bastard of a great lord. Sam, the disowned son of a cruel father. Jon, what was that? I don't know, Jon replied, his breath misting in air that seemed to have dropped 20 degrees in an instant. But look, he pointed north. The aurora that sometimes danced in the northern sky had intensified, but the colors were wrong, too green, too bright, too purposeful in their movements. And beneath that eerie light, Jon could see movement, not the movement of trees and wind or animals seeking shelter. Something else, something large. We need to tell the old bear, Sam said, already backing toward the stairs. Wait, Jon grabbed his arm. Look there, at the tree line, where the forest met the open ground before the wall. Figures were emerging, not the shambling dead of legend, but living people, wildlings, by their rough clothing and savage appearance. Except they weren't raiding or attacking. They were running, fleeing. Dozens of them, then hundreds, pouring out of the forest as if pursued by demons. 7 hells, Sam breathed. What are they running from? Jon didn't answer, because he'd seen what Sam hadn't. Behind the fleeing wildlings, deeper in the forest where the strange green light barely penetrated, there were other shapes, taller, moving with predatory grace, and even from this distance, Jon could see that their eyes reflected the light like a wolf's, except wolves' eyes glowed amber or yellow. These eyes glowed blue. By the time they reached Lord Commander Jair Mormont's chambers, the old man was already awake and armored. The old bear had served on the wall for decades. He knew when something was wrong the way a sailor knows when a storm is coming. Report, he said tersely as Jon and Sam burst in. Jon told him everything: the rupture, the cold, the wildlings fleeing, the shapes with blue eyes. Mormont listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each word. How many wildlings? He asked when Jon finished. Hundreds, my lord, maybe more. They're massing at the base of the wall, but they're not trying to climb, they're just waiting. Waiting for what? For us to let them through, Jon said, though he couldn't explain how he knew this. They're not raiders, they're refugees. Mormont was silent for a long moment. The Night's Watch had fought the wildlings for centuries. They were the enemy beyond the wall. Savages who preyed on northern villages, who recognized no law but strength. Letting them through the wall, even in small numbers, was unthinkable. And these other shapes you saw? Mormont finally asked, with the blue eyes? I don't know what they were, my lord, but the wildlings were terrified. I've never seen wildlings terrified before. Another long silence. Then Mormont stood and walked to his window, looking north toward the wall and what lay beyond. He said quietly, about the long night. About the others, creatures of ice and darkness that came from the uttermost north, raising the dead to serve them. For 8,000 years they've been gone, so long that most men believe they never existed at all. But the wall was built for a reason, and it wasn't just to keep out wildlings. He turned back to face Jon and Sam. Whatever happened tonight, this rupture, this change in the world, something woke up. Something that's been sleeping for a very long time. And if the wildlings are running south in such numbers. He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. What do we do, my lord? Jon asked. "We watch," Mormont replied. "We send ravens to Winterfell and King's Landing, warning them that something is wrong beyond the wall. And we prepare. If the old stories are true, if the others are returning, then the realm needs to know whether they'll listen." He shook his head. "That's another matter entirely." "Will we let the wildlings through?" Sam asked nervously. Mormont considered this. "If they're truly fleeing something worse, and if that something is what I fear, then the wildlings aren't the enemy anymore. The enemy is what drove them here." He looked at both young men, his eyes hard as iron. "Go. Spread the word. Every man on the wall needs to be alert, and send my steward to the rookery. I need to right those ravens." As John and Sam left the commander's chambers, John couldn't shake the image of those blue eyes in the darkness. Couldn't forget the sensation of that malevolent cold pressing against the wall. And couldn't ignore the certainty, deep in his bones, that Maester Luwin's tales of the long night stories he'd heard as a child in Winterfell were about to become reality. The old stories were true, and the old monsters were waking. In Winterfell, as dawn broke over the strange new world, Ned Stark received the first reports from his riders. The north had been transformed. New forests covered lands that had been open moors. Rivers ran in directions that defied the old maps. Mountains rose where hills had been. And everywhere, along the borders where the old north met the new lands, there were signs of something else. Trees of species no northern maester could identify. Stone formations that seemed almost deliberately shaped, as if by ancient hands. And tracks, footprints in mud and snow that were almost human but not quite, too large and too regular to be natural. "What are we dealing with?" Catelyn asked as they reviewed the reports in the solar. "I don't know," Ned admitted, "but I know someone who might." He'd been thinking about this since the first reports came in. Maester Luwin has books, old texts from the Citadel, references to ancient times, to legends that might not be as legendary as we thought. If something similar has happened before— "My lord," a guardsman burst into the room, his face flushed with exertion. "A raven from Castle Black, from Lord Commander Mormont. He says it's urgent." Ned took the message and read it quickly. Then read it again, more slowly, as if hoping the words might change. They didn't. "What is it?" Catelyn asked, concern sharpening her voice. "Mormont says the wall has been compromised. Not broken, but damaged. And there's movement beyond it. Large-scale movement. Wildlings fleeing south. And something pursuing them. Something he describes as—" Ned paused, hardly able to speak the words. "As the others." Catelyn went pale. Even in the south, the stories of the others were known. The long night. The darkness that nearly consumed the world 8,000 years ago. The dead that walked and served masters of ice and cold. Children's tales, except he's asking for reinforcements, Ned continued, and for the information to be passed to King's Landing. He says the realm needs to know. "Will they believe him?" Catelyn asked. "I don't know," Ned replied honestly. "I'm not sure I believe him, but Jeor Mormont is no fool, and he wouldn't send such a message lightly." He stood, decision made. "Prepare a rider for King's Landing. And send word to our bannermen I want every northern house on alert. If there's even a chance Mormont is right. Then winter isn't just coming," Catelyn finished. "It's already here." Across the narrow sea, in the free cities of Essos, the rupture had been felt less keenly but no less significantly. Daenerys Targaryen stood in the tent that served as her temporary home, her hands resting on 3 stone eggs that had been given to her as a wedding gift. They were beautiful things, covered in scales that caught the light like gems, one deep green, one cream and gold, one black as midnight. Petrified dragon eggs, her brother Viserys had told her dismissively, valuable as art but nothing more. Dragons were dead, gone from the world for over a century, except the eggs were warm. They'd always been faintly warm, as if they retained some memory of the heat in which they'd been formed. But since last night, since that strange moment when the world seemed to pause and then lurch sideways, the warmth had intensified. Now they were hot to the touch, almost burning, and Daenerys could swear she felt something moving within them, a flutter, a pulse, like a heartbeat. Khaleesi. She turned to find Ser Jorah Mormont standing at the tent entrance. The exiled knight had attached himself to her service recently, whether out of genuine loyalty or simple opportunism she wasn't yet sure. But he was useful, knowledgeable, and one of the few people in this foreign land who spoke her language. "Did you feel it?" she asked. "Last night, something changed. I felt something," Jorah admitted, as did everyone in the Khalasar. Khal Drogo's blood riders are saying it's an omen. They're trying to decide if it's a good omen or a bad one. "And what do you think?" Jorah stepped closer, his eyes falling on the eggs in her hands. His expression changed, became more guarded. "I think the world is stranger than we give it credit for, and I think those eggs shouldn't be as warm as they are." Daenerys looked down at them. In the morning light, the scales seemed to shimmer with an inner luminescence. "My brother says they're just stone, valuable, but dead." "Your brother," Jorah said carefully, "says many things. Not all of them are true." It was the most direct criticism of Viserys that Jorah had voiced, and Daenerys felt a small thrill at hearing someone else acknowledge what she'd known for years, that her brother was not the wise, rightful king he claimed to be. He was cruel, petty, unstable, but he was all she had. No, that wasn't true anymore. She had Drogo now, this massive Dothraki warlord who'd claimed her as his wife. She had this Khalasar, these warriors who followed her husband with absolute loyalty. And she had these eggs, warm in her hands, calling to something deep inside her. "The world is changing," she said quietly. "I can feel it. Something is beginning." "Or ending," Jorah replied. "In my experience, great changes bring great danger." "Or great opportunity," Daenerys countered. She looked at the knight directly. "You served my father. Sir Barristan told me that before we left Pentos. You fought for Robert Baratheon afterward. You've seen kingdoms rise and fall. What would you say is happening?" Jorah was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I would say the game is changing. The rules we thought we understood are being rewritten, and whoever adapts fastest to the new rules will have an advantage." He gestured to the eggs. "If I were you, Khaleesi, I'd keep those close, and I'd pay very close attention to what they're telling you." In the shadow of Orthanc, the great black tower of Isengard, Saruman the White stood at his window and smiled. He'd felt the rupture like everyone else, but unlike the panic and confusion that gripped others, Saruman felt only satisfaction. This was his doing, not directly, perhaps, but the culmination of years of careful planning, subtle manipulations, and forbidden research. The boundaries between worlds were not natural phenomena. They were constructs, woven by powers in the ancient days to separate what should not be joined. Saruman had discovered this truth in his studies, buried in texts older than Gondor, written in languages that predated the common speech. And he discovered something else. Those boundaries could be weakened, torn, broken. It had taken years of work, channeling power through the Palantir, exploiting tiny flaws in the fabric of reality, waiting for the precise alignment of forces that would allow the rupture to occur. But now it was done. Two worlds had become one, and in the chaos that would inevitably follow, Saruman saw opportunity. Westeros, he'd learned through his scrying, was a land of kingdoms at peace barely, a veneer of order maintained by tradition and the threat of royal power, but underneath, seething rivalries and ambitions. The lords of Westeros spent their lives maneuvering for advantage, building alliances, plotting against rivals. They were sophisticated in their politics, but primitive in their understanding of real power. They had no concept of magic, no experience with beings like elves or wizards, no understanding of artifacts of power. And somewhere in their kingdom, the One Ring now lay, waiting to be found by someone who would see it as merely another tool, another means to an end, someone who would use it without understanding what they were using. Saruman had spent centuries as one of the Istari, one of the wizards sent to Middle-earth to guide and counsel the free peoples against the darkness. He'd played that role well, earned trust and respect. But he'd also grown tired of it, tired of being the advisor, the second voice, the one who guided from the shadows while others took the glory. The ring had been destroyed once, or so everyone believed. Sauron defeated, his spirit dispersed. But Saruman knew better. The ring couldn't be destroyed by normal means. It required the fires of Mount Doom, and Mount Doom was now on the other side of the world, perhaps impossible to reach. Which meant the ring still existed, still contained Sauron's essence, still offered the same promise of power it always had. If Saruman could claim it before the elves found it, if he could reach Westeros and position himself as advisor to one of these ambitious lords, if he could guide their hand while the ring guided his, he would be more than a wizard, more than an advisor. He would be the power behind the throne, and eventually, the power on the throne itself. The elves would be too late. Gandalf would be too trusting, and the Westerosi would be too ignorant to realize they were being used until it was far too late. Grima, he called, and his servant appeared from the shadows. Grima Wormtongue was a man of Rohan, exiled for crimes Saruman had never bothered to learn the details of. But he was useful, clever, amoral, willing to do whatever was necessary. Master, send word to our agents in the east. I want eyes and ears in this Westeros. Find me men who can move among them without attracting attention. Traders, sellswords, anyone who can establish themselves and report back. I need to know the political landscape, who's ambitious, who's ruthless, who's desperate enough to accept help from unusual sources. It shall be done, Master. And the search for the ring is our highest priority, Saruman replied. But we must be subtle. The elves will be searching as well, and if they suspect our true intentions. He shook his head. No, we play the long game. We offer assistance to these Westerosi lords. We establish ourselves as valuable allies. And while everyone is watching the obvious moves, we quietly search for the one thing that matters. Grima bowed and departed. Saruman turned back to his window, looking out over Isengard, his mind already racing through possibilities and plans. The great game was beginning. And this time, Saruman the White intended to win. By midday in Winterfell, the castle was in controlled chaos, as reports continued to arrive and decisions needed to be made. Ned stood in his solar, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Catelyn, Maester Luwin, Sir Roderick Castle, and his eldest son, Robb. Maps covered the table, but they were already outdated, marked with territories that no longer matched reality. We need to make contact, Ned said, studying the map that showed the new borders. If there are truly other peoples in these new lands, these tall, beautiful beings the traders speak of, we need to understand who they are and what they want. Send word to the villages along the border. Tell them to approach any strangers peacefully, to offer hospitality rather than weapons. That's a risk, my lord, Sir Roderick warned. We don't know if these strangers are friendly. We also don't know that they're hostile, Ned countered. And I'd rather err on the side of caution than start a war through misunderstanding. Father, Robb spoke up, his voice carrying the carefully measured tone of a young man trying to prove himself worthy of being taken seriously. What about the Lannisters? You know Tywin will be positioning his forces to claim as much of this new territory as possible. If we're too cautious while they're aggressive, then we'll deal with that when it comes, Ned interrupted, though not unkindly. The Lannisters will always be the Lannisters. But right now we face something unprecedented. The entire world has changed overnight, Robb. In times like these, honor and caution will serve us better than ambition. Even as he spoke the words, Ned wondered if he truly believed them. He'd spent enough time in King's Landing to know how men like Tywin Lannister thought. Every crisis was an opportunity. Every moment of confusion was a chance to gain advantage. While Ned counseled caution and cooperation, Tywin would be moving chess pieces, positioning forces, making alliances. By the time Ned understood what was happening, the Lannisters might already control half the new territories. But what was the alternative? To abandon the principles he'd lived by his entire life? To become like them? "There's something else, my lord," Maester Luwin said quietly. He held up a small book, ancient leather binding cracking with age. "I've been searching through the older texts in our library, references to similar events in history, and I found something disturbing." He opened the book to a marked page, covered in text so faded it was barely legible. "This is from the Age of Heroes, 8,000 years ago. It describes an event called the Breaking. Listen to this. In the time before time, when the world was young and the boundaries were thin, there came a great sundering. The earth itself tore asunder, and that which was separate became one. Magic returned to the world, and with it came wonders and terrors in equal measure. But the greatest terror was the cold, for the breaking woke that which should have remained sleeping, and winter came in a form no summer could overcome. Silence filled the solar. Finally, Catelyn spoke. "The long night." "The long night," Luwin confirmed. "According to legend, it began shortly after an event that sounds remarkably similar to what we've just experienced. The boundaries between worlds or realms the texts aren't clear collapsed, and something that had been dormant woke up." "The others," Ned said quietly, thinking of Mormont's raven, "the White Walkers of legend." "If the legends are true," Luwin said, "and if this rupture is similar to the breaking described in these texts, then we may be facing more than just political reorganization. We may be facing an existential threat to all life." "That's impossible," Robb said, though he sounded less certain than his words suggested. "The others are children's tales, ghost stories to frighten young boys." "The people of the Age of Heroes probably thought the same thing," Luwin replied. "Until winter came." Ned looked at the maester, then at his son, then at his wife. Catelyn's face showed the same concern he felt. They had children: Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. If there was even a chance that something dark was waking in the north, he needed to protect them. But how did you protect against legends made real? "We proceed carefully," he decided. "We send that raven to King's Landing, including Mormont's warning. We continue gathering information about these new lands and their inhabitants. And we prepare. Whatever is coming, whether it's political conflict or something worse, we make sure the North is ready." 3 days after the rupture, on a muddy road somewhere between the Old North and the new Eastern lands, a merchant caravan encountered something that would change everything. Beren was a practical man. He'd been trading goods between northern villages for 20 years, knew every road and shortcut, could predict weather patterns and bandit movements with equal accuracy. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or belief in supernatural nonsense, which made what he was seeing all the more difficult to accept. The road ahead, the same road he'd traveled hundreds of times, now passed through a forest that hadn't existed 4 days ago. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than houses, their branches forming a canopy so dense that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. But it wasn't the size of the trees that made Beren's hands shake on the reins of his cart. It was the figure standing in the road ahead, taller than any man Beren had ever seen, perhaps 7 feet or more, slender but clearly strong, with movements that suggested both grace and power. Dressed in clothing of unfamiliar cut, colored in shades of green and gray that seemed to shift and blend with the forest. And the face. Gods, the face. Impossibly beautiful, with features too perfect to be human. High cheekbones, large eyes that seemed to catch and reflect light like a cat's, skin that seemed to glow faintly in the forest gloom. This was no man. This was something else, something from the old stories, from the tales grandmothers told to wide-eyed children. "Elves," breathed Harwin, Beren's assistant and nephew. "Sweet mother of mercy, they're real." There were three of them now. More had emerged from the forest, moving so silently that Baron hadn't noticed them until they were already present. They didn't approach threateningly, but they also didn't retreat. They simply stood, watching the caravan with expressions that suggested both curiosity and caution. "What do we do?" Harwin whispered, his hand drifting toward the sword at his belt. "Don't," Baron hissed, grabbing his nephew's wrist. "Don't even think about drawing steel. We have no idea what they're capable of." One of the figures, the tallest, with long golden hair bound in an intricate braid, took a step forward. When he spoke, his voice carried a musical quality that made the common tongue sound like song. "Peace, travelers. We mean you no harm. We seek only information and, if possible, cooperation." Baron swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Who? What are you?" "My name is Legolas of the Woodland Realm," the golden-haired figure replied. "These are my companions. We are representatives of the Elven kingdoms, seeking to understand what has occurred and to establish peaceful contact with the people of this land." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "We understand this must be frightening. Your world and ours have been joined in ways we do not fully comprehend, but we wish to find peaceful coexistence, not conflict." "Elves," Baron said, and the word felt strange in his mouth. "You're actually elves, like in the old stories." "I am unfamiliar with your stories," Legolas replied, "but yes, we are what you might call elves." "And you are humans of Westeros, yes? Of the north?" "We're just traders," Harwin said nervously, "from a village near Winterfell. We were traveling to Wintertown when the world changed." "Winterfell," one of the other elves repeated. "We have heard this name. It is a great fortress, yes?" "The seat of the Lord who rules this region." "Lord Stark," Baron confirmed. "Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North." Legolas and his companions exchanged glances, communicating something in a look that Baron couldn't interpret. Finally, Legolas turned back to the merchants. "We would speak with this Lord Stark. We have matters of great importance to discuss with the rulers of your land. Would you be willing to guide us to Winterfell?" Baron's mind raced. On one hand, this was far beyond his authority or comfort. On the other hand, these beings, these elves, were asking politely, not demanding. And something in Legolas's voice suggested sincerity. If they truly meant peace, and if he was the one who brought them to Lord Stark. "We can take you," he said finally. "But I should warn you, humans aren't used to your kind. There may be fear, possibly hostility." "We understand," Legolas replied. "But we must try. The alternative, if our peoples misunderstand each other's intentions, could be catastrophic." Something in the way he said that last word made Baron's stomach clench. There was weight there, implications he couldn't quite grasp. But he nodded. "Come then, Winterfell is 2 days' ride. You're welcome to travel with our caravan." As the elves fell in beside the merchant carts, and as Baron turned his horses back toward Winterfell, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something historic. The old world was truly gone. Whatever came next would be shaped by how humans and elves and whatever other beings existed in these new lands learned to exist together, or failed to. In King's Landing, while Ned Stark worried about honor and Baron guided elves toward Winterfell, Padir Baelish was doing what he did best, turning chaos into opportunity. Littlefinger's offices in the capital were modest compared to those of greater lords, but they were positioned perfectly close enough to the Red Keep to access power, far enough to maintain discretion. His true power didn't come from grand halls or impressive titles. It came from information, and the ability to use that information before anyone else. "Tell me everything," he said to the man standing before him, a ship captain who'd just returned from Dorne. "The whole coast has changed, my lord," the captain reported. "Ports that were deep-water harbors are now shallow bays. New islands have appeared where there was only open sea. And the trade routes." He shook his head. "Everything we knew is wrong now. A ship following the old charts would run aground within a day." And the Dornish response? Prince Doran has closed the borders. No one in or out until they understand what's happened. But word is that strange folk have been seen in the mountains tall, moving like ghosts, speaking languages no one understands. Littlefinger listened carefully, filing away every detail. This was the third such report he'd received, and a pattern was emerging. The rupture hadn't just changed geography, it had introduced entirely new populations to Westeros. Populations that the great lords were only beginning to discover. "And the object I asked you to search for?" he asked quietly. The captain shook his head. "No word, my lord. If there's a ring matching that description, I haven't heard whispers of it." Littlefinger dismissed the captain with a small purse of coins and turned to his window, overlooking the chaotic streets of King's Landing. The ring. That's what the elven texts he'd acquired through irregular channels called it. The One Ring, forged in ancient times, containing power beyond mortal understanding. When he'd first read about it, buried in a manuscript stolen from a burning elven convoy, he'd had nothing to do with the attack itself, but he'd been quick to acquire the goods. Littlefinger had dismissed it as mythology, but the description had been specific. A simple gold band, unadorned, unremarkable to look at, but impossible to destroy. And it granted its bearer power, not the crude power of swords and armies, but the subtle power of influence and domination. The kind of power Littlefinger had spent his life cultivating through intelligence and manipulation. If such a thing truly existed, and if it was now loose in Westeros, a knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." Varys glided into the room, his powder-scented robes rustling softly. The Spider and Littlefinger had a relationship that was equal parts cooperation and competition. Both recognized the other as a master of information, and both understood that destroying each other would be counterproductive. But neither trusted the other an inch. "Lord Baelish," Varys said with his usual artificial smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting?" "Only my attempts to understand a world gone mad," Littlefinger replied smoothly. "Have your little birds brought interesting news?" "Oh, my little birds are singing quite frantically," Varys replied, settling into a chair without being invited. "Tales of impossible beings in the new forests, of ancient weapons found in mysterious ruins, of ships that sail into morning mist and don't return. But the most interesting song is one about strangers heading toward Winterfell. Tall strangers with sharp ears and sharper eyes, led by someone called Legolas." Littlefinger kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Elves. Moving toward the north. That changed things. "And what does the Spider think of these tall strangers?" he asked. "I think," Varys said carefully, "that they represent either a tremendous opportunity or a tremendous threat, possibly both. They claim to seek peace, but they're also searching for something. My little birds couldn't quite catch what, but they're very interested in finding an object, something of great value, the ring. They were searching for the ring too. Perhaps," Littlefinger said slowly, "we should ensure that if this object is found, it's found by someone who understands its value, someone in Westeros, rather than these foreign visitors." Varys tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "And who would you suggest?" "Someone who could use it to bring stability to the realm," Littlefinger replied. "Someone who understands that power must be wielded carefully, but wielded nonetheless. Perhaps someone on the small council, someone who has the realm's best interests at heart." "How noble," Varys murmured. "And completely unlike you, Lord Baelish. What's your real interest in this mysterious object?" Littlefinger smiled. "The same as yours, Lord Varys. Knowledge, power, the ability to shape events rather than being shaped by them. We're more alike than you'd care to admit." "Perhaps," Varys replied, standing to leave. "Or perhaps you're simply more ambitious. I serve the realm, Lord Baelish. You serve only yourself." After Varys departed, Littlefinger stood at his window for a long time, watching the city below. The game was becoming more complex, the players more numerous, but complexity was where he thrived. Others might see chaos. Littlefinger saw possibility. Somewhere in this new world, a ring of power waited to be found, and whoever found it first would reshape the future of Westeros. He intended to make sure that person was him. In the Red Keep's royal apartments, Cersei Lannister was dealing with a different kind of power, the kind that came from youth, cruelty, and an absolute lack of empathy. Her son Joffrey, Prince of the Seven Kingdoms and heir to the Iron Throne, was 12 years old and already everything she'd feared he might become. She saw Jaime in his features, the golden hair, the handsome face, but she saw nothing of Jaime's complexity, his hidden depths, his capacity for both honor and shame. Instead, she saw only herself reflected back, ambition without restraint, pride without wisdom, and something else, something she didn't see in herself because she couldn't admit it existed. Madness. "Mother," Joffrey said, examining a small bird he'd captured in the gardens. He held it carelessly, his fingers pressing just hard enough to make it struggle. "The servants are saying the world has changed, that there are monsters in the new forests. Is it true?" "There are new lands," Cersei replied carefully, "and new peoples. Whether they're monsters remains to be seen." "I hope they are monsters," Joffrey said, and there was something in his voice, an eagerness, a hunger that made even Cersei uncomfortable. "Then we can hunt them. Father is always hunting boars and deer. I want to hunt something that fights back." "You're too young for such talk." "I'm a prince," Joffrey countered, and the bird in his hand stopped struggling. Cersei realized with quiet horror that he'd squeezed too hard. The prince looked at the dead bird with mild interest, then tossed it aside. "I should be allowed to hunt whatever I want." Cersei watched her son, her beautiful, terrible son, and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. Joffrey would be king one day, when Robert finally drank himself to death or died in some hunting accident. And when that happened, he would have absolute power over the Seven Kingdoms. The thought should have filled her with triumph. Instead, for the first time in years, Cersei Lannister felt something very close to fear. "You'll be king," she said quietly. "When that time comes, you'll be able to do as you please. But until then, you must be careful. The realm is changing, Joffrey. New powers are emerging. We must be smart about how we respond." "Why be smart when we can be strong?" Joffrey replied. "Father says strength is all that matters. The strong take what they want, and the weak suffer. I'm going to be strong." After Joffrey left, called away by the weapons master for his afternoon training, Cersei sat alone in her chambers, thinking about strength and power and the throne that pulsed with that strange warmth whenever she touched it. The world was changing, that much was clear. But perhaps the change favored those willing to be ruthless. Perhaps the old rules, the careful balance of honor and tradition and mutual respect were dissolving along with the old geography. Perhaps the new world would belong to those who took what they wanted without hesitation or remorse. Cersei stood and walked to her window, looking out over King's Landing. Somewhere beyond those walls, new lands were appearing, new peoples were arriving, new possibilities were emerging. And somewhere in all that chaos, there had to be opportunities for someone clever enough to seize them. She thought of the throne room, of that pulse of power she'd felt. She thought of Joffrey's casual cruelty and her father's ruthless pragmatism. She thought of her twin brother Jaime, sworn to the Kingsguard and therefore unable to inherit, unable to marry, unable to openly acknowledge his relationship with her. And she thought, what if I didn't need Joffrey to be king? What if I could rule in my own right? The thought was intoxicating and terrifying and possibly treasonous, but it wouldn't leave her mind. The world was changing. Perhaps she could change with it. That evening, in a tavern near the docks of King's Landing, another key player in the coming drama was drowning his frustrations in wine. Tyrion Lannister was not having a good week. He'd come to King's Landing at his father's summons, expecting to be given some meaningless task that would keep him out of the way while Tywin handled the real business of responding to the rupture. Instead, he'd been assigned to investigate opportunities in the new territories, which was Tywin's way of saying, figure out how we can profit from this before anyone else does. It should have been an interesting challenge. Tyrion enjoyed puzzles, and the rupture was certainly that. But what bothered him was the sense that everyone, his father, the small council, even his sister, was approaching this as if it were just another political problem to be solved through manipulation and force. They're not seeing the bigger picture, he muttered to his wine cup. Talking to yourself, my lord? A voice asked. That's usually a sign of genius or madness. Tyrion looked up to find a dwarf standing beside his table, not a child, but a full-grown man who happened to be even shorter than Tyrion himself. His clothes were weathered, his face scarred, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. Sometimes both, Tyrion replied, gesturing to the empty chair. Care to join me? I find drinking alone depressing, and drinking with fools insufferable. You look like you might be neither. The man sat, waving to the tavern keeper for his own cup. Name's Bronn, and you're one of the Lannisters, unless I miss my guess, though which one, I couldn't say. The clever one, Tyrion replied. Which makes me either the most valuable or the least useful, depending on who you ask. What brings a man like you to the capital in times like these? Same thing that brings everyone, Bronn replied. Opportunity. Word is the world's gotten bigger overnight. New lands mean new fortunes to be made, new dangers to guard against. Men like me, we tend to do well when things get chaotic. A sellsword, Tyrion observed, among other things. But yes, I sell my sword to whoever's buying. And from what I hear, there's going to be plenty of buying in the near future. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Question is, are the buyers going to be smart about what they're facing? Or are they going to charge into this new world the same way they've always done things, assuming strength and steel can solve every problem? Tyrion studied the man. There was something refreshingly direct about Bronn, none of the courtly games or false politeness that infected the Red Keep. What would you do, he asked, if you were advising the great lords on how to respond to the rupture? Me? Bronn laughed. I'd tell them to stop thinking about how to conquer the new territories and start thinking about what the new territories might do to them. I've heard stories, my lord, from traders and travelers passing through. Things that don't make sense, people who aren't people, creatures that shouldn't exist, if even half those stories are true. Then we're playing a game we don't understand. Tyrion finished. He raised his cup. To wisdom in a world gone mad. May those who have it survive long enough to use it. They drank, and as they did, Tyrion felt something shift in his understanding. Everyone else was focused on opportunity, on advantage, on how to exploit the rupture for political or economic gain. But what if the rupture wasn't an opportunity at all? What if it was a warning, a sign that forces beyond human understanding were in motion, and that all the political maneuvering in the world wouldn't matter if those forces decided to act? He thought of the stories he'd heard, tall beings in the forests, strange magic in the new lands, reports from the wall about increasing cold and mysterious movements. He thought of his family's plans to secure new territories and forge new alliances. And he thought, we're all missing something, something important. The question was, would anyone figure it out before it was too late? Far to the south, in Gondor, Boromir, son of Denethor, was preparing for a journey that would take him into the heart of Westeros and into the center of the coming storm. Boromir was a warrior, born and trained to defend his people against the darkness. He'd fought orcs in the mountains and raiders from the east. He'd held bridges that seemed impossible to hold and led charges that seemed destined to fail. He was brave, skilled, and absolutely loyal to Gondor. He was also proud, and that pride would shape the history of two worlds. You understand your mission, his father Denethor said, reviewing the maps of this new land called Westeros. Find this ring that was lost in the rupture, secure it for Gondor before the elves can claim it. Why not work with the elves? Boromir asked, though he kept his tone respectful. If the ring is as dangerous as they claim, because the elves have guided Middle-earth for ages, and where has it gotten us? Denethor interrupted, his voice bitter. We fight and die while they sit in their golden halls, singing songs of ages past. They had their chance to shape the world. Perhaps it's time for men to take the lead. Boromir wanted to argue, but he recognized the futility. His father had grown increasingly bitter over the years, increasingly resentful of Gondor's diminished status. The rupture, in Denethor's mind, was an opportunity to restore Gondor's greatness, and if the ring could help with that, "I'll find it," Boromir promised, "and I'll bring it back to Gondor." "See that you do," Denethor replied, "and be wary of the elves. Gandalf has already left to make contact with these Westerosi. He'll try to establish elven influence over them, to position the elves as the wise guides and counselors. Don't let him succeed. Make alliances of your own. Show these Westerosi that men of Middle-earth are their true equals and natural allies." As Boromir left his father's chambers and prepared for the journey, he felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Find the ring. Secure Gondor's future. Prove that men could lead without elven guidance. It was a heavy burden, but Boromir had carried heavy burdens before. He would carry this one too. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the ring he sought would call to him in ways he couldn't anticipate, that the pride driving him would make him vulnerable to its whispers, that the very qualities that made him a hero of Gondor would make him prey to forces he didn't understand. The ring was waiting, and it was patient. As the sun set on this first day of the new world, in a dozen different locations across Westeros and Middle-earth, pieces were being put into motion. In Winterfell, Ned Stark received word that unusual travelers were approaching, tall, strange, claiming to seek peace. He ordered them welcomed with caution and respect. At Castle Black, Jon Snow stood atop the wall, watching the north, where the cold continued to intensify and shadows moved in the darkness. In King's Landing, Littlefinger sent more agents into the streets, searching for any whisper of a powerful artifact, while Cersei sat on the Iron Throne after midnight, feeling it pulse beneath her, wondering what that pulse meant. In Gondor, Boromir gathered supplies for his journey, his mind fixed on glory and duty and the mission that would save his people. In Rivendell, Elrond stood before an ancient map, trying to calculate where the ring might have fallen, knowing that every hour it remained lost brought the world closer to catastrophe. And in Isengard, Saruman worked late into the night, coordinating his agents, planning his moves, seeing opportunities where others saw only chaos. None of them yet understood that they were all connected, that the ring would draw them together like iron to a lodestone, that their choices would cascade into consequences none could foresee, that the game they thought they were playing was merely preparation for a far more terrible game to come. But deep in the lands of always winter, beyond the wall, in places where no human had set foot in 8,000 years, something ancient stirred. The Night King stood on a peak of eternal ice, and for the first time in millennia, he felt the change. The boundaries had fallen. Magic had returned. And with magic came possibility. For thousands of years, the White Walkers had been dormant, contained beyond the wall by ancient enchantments and the vigilance of the Night's Watch. But the rupture had weakened those enchantments, fractured them, and through those fractures, the cold was seeping south. The Night King raised his hand, and in the frozen wastes, the dead began to stir. Not many yet, just the recently fallen, those whose bodies had been preserved by the unnatural cold. But they rose, and they waited. Winter was not coming. Winter was already here. The living just didn't know it yet. And far to the south, in warm halls and comfortable chambers, lords and ladies and wizards and warriors continued their scheming and planning, their alliances and betrayals, their careful political calculations. None of them yet understood that their politics, their ambitions, their clever plans, all of it was about to become irrelevant in the face of something far older and far more terrible than any of them could imagine. The world had changed. And the true horror was that this was only the beginning. Night fell across the merged world, two worlds now one, magic and politics intertwining, ancient threats and modern ambitions colliding. And in that darkness, in 100 different places, decisions were being made that would shape everything to come. Ned Stark prepared to meet with elves, choosing honor over suspicion. Jon Snow stood his watch, feeling the cold increase, writing another warning that would be ignored. Cersei Lannister sat on the Iron Throne, feeling its warmth, beginning to plan. Littlefinger sent out his agents, searching for a ring he didn't fully understand. Boromir began his journey, carrying his father's pride and his people's hopes. Gandalf and Aragorn rode toward Westeros, hoping to arrive before disaster struck. Saruman worked in shadow, manipulating events, seeing himself as the architect of a new order. And the ring, the one ring, forged in darkness and destruction, lay somewhere in this vast new world, waiting for the hand that would claim it, waiting to fulfill its purpose, waiting to call its master home. The pieces were in motion. The game had begun, and every player believed they understood what they were fighting for. None of them yet realized they were fighting for survival itself. The rupture had not been an accident. It had not been random chance. It had been orchestrated by whom or what, not even Saruman fully understood. But orchestrated it had been, to bring together forces that were meant to remain separate, to wake powers that were meant to sleep, to set in motion events that could not be stopped. Two worlds, one ring, and winter coming, patient and inevitable as death. This was the world that changed. This was the day everything began, and somewhere in the darkness, something laughed, a sound like ice cracking, like the last breath of dying men, like the end of all things. The Game of Thrones was about to become something far more terrible. A game of survival. A game no one could win, but everyone would have to play. And the clock was ticking toward midnight.